My name is Sydney York, and I decided to do my research paper over the women's suffrage movement. In the 1920s, millions of women in America were finally able to exercise their right to vote. But for all of this to happen, you have to go back about 72 years from whenever it all started. Different activists challenged traditional views of how women should act, and it allowed them to succeed and ultimately secure the right to the 19th Amendment. Around this time, could not own property, they had no legal claim to the money that they earned, and they still had no right to vote. They were expected to focus on household work and motherhood. They could not participate in politics. The males were the ones that were involved with the political business. The women's suffrage movement started around the 1820s, but it wasn't until the 1848 when women had their first ever women's suffrage movement convention, and this was held in Seneca Falls in New York. They decided to debate and discuss over the rights of women, and there was around 300 people there. And they were able to debate and discuss over the rights of women, and this was done by 68 women and 32 men. There wasn't just women at this convention, there was also men that attended, and one of the men that was there was a former African American slave and activist, Frederick Douglass. During their time at Seneca, they delegated and agreed that American women were individuals who deserved their own political identities. A small group went on to produce the Declaration of Sentiments, and this document was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence states that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in the sentiments, it states that men and women should be created equal. And this is meant that they believe women had the right to vote. This allowed many other conventions to be held in America from the 1850s to the 1860s. Unfortunately, the Civil War was during this time, and this caused the women's suffrage movement to lose momentum. The women turned their attention to assisting in the effort related to the conflict between the states. And after the war, women's suffrage endured yet another setback. The women found themselves not able to agree with the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment stated that they were allowing for black men to have the right to vote. Women were not included. So they found themselves they were not included, and they felt like they deserved the right to be included. In the 1830s, there were various reform groups that were all across the United States. Some examples of these groups were temperance groups, religious movements, moral reform societies, and anti-slavery organizations. And they were huge staples in the movement, and they were ultimately ran by women. The movement began when people started to get involved, and the people that were involved decided to split up into two different groups. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, and this group primarily organized their goal to achieve voting rights for women by the means of congressional amendment and to the Constitution. The second group was called the Women's Association, and this group included Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, and there were others. A strong and outspoken advocate for the women's rights movement, and she was also determined that the 14th Amendment would include the right for women to vote. These women took risky strides to be able to get what they deserved and wanted. Susan B. Anthony was at the Ulysses S. Grant 1868 presidential election, and she was arrested for illegally voting for him. She was not the only one. There was 15 other women that were with her that were arrested. The associations that were ran by these women were later merged together. They became the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and this was ran by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. When the two groups combined in the 1890s, the approach of what they wanted ultimately changed. They wanted to lobby for women's rights to vote from a state-to-state basis. Also, instead of pushing for women to have the same rights and responsibilities as men because women and men were created equal, they decided that they didn't believe in that anymore, and they deserved the right to vote because they were different. Hard to gain their rights, and a women's suffrage amendment was proposed to the U.S. Congress. When the proposal finally reached the Senate in 1886, it was unfortunately defeated and would continue to fail as it went on. Within 6 years, by 1896, women had gained the right to vote in 4 different states, and these states were Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. Wyoming was the first to grant female residents the right to vote. The head leaders, Stanton and Anthony, unfortunately passed away during the movement. After their passing, Carrie Chapman Catt stepped in to lead the NASWA, and she was able to achieve success for the movement and for women. Other states between 1910 and 1918 all extended the right to vote to women. These states were Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Michigan, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New York, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon, South Dakota, and finally Washington. And they were able to allow women the right to vote. During this time, Stanton's daughter, Harriet Stanton Blanche, introduced parades, pickets, and marches to allow to raise awareness in Washington, D.C. As time went on, President Woodrow Wilson decided to change his stand on his views on the women's right movement. In 1918, he decided that he was going to support women's rights. Even though the president supported the women, it still continued to fail when it reached the Senate. A year had passed, and a representative of the name James R. Mann, he was a Republican from Illinois and a chairman of the Suffrage Committee, he proposed to the House a resolution to approve the amendment. On May 21st, 1919, it passed in the House by 42 votes. And once it was passed in the Senate, it was sent to the states for ratification. This allowed for 35 states to approve the amendment. The last one was Tennessee, which would ultimately give the 3/4 of the states to pass the amendment. One of the Tennessee Republicans' representative by the name of Harry T. Byrne was the last deciding vote to push this over the edge. He was originally opposed to the amendment, but his mother continued to say that she took over 72 years to finally send him letters saying, "Don't forget to be a good boy." It was a long and hard road for women and activists to gain, and this ultimately swayed the 19th Amendment reached. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged was finally United States or by any state in effect on account of sex. By the Secretary of State opened up so many opportunities for women. It was also a huge stride the ultimate right to vote in America fight today for equal rights for both elections to come.